Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Eruvin Daf Dalet. We're on Daf Gimel Beis at the last line, and we'll move discussing the concept of measuring with an amma. Abaye taught us that there are two different types of ammas. Now, an amma is generally comprised of tfachim, the fists. So a fist consists of 4 etzbos lying side by side. Now, how many tfachim are contained in an amma? So Abaye tells us sometimes we have the 5 tefach amma, and sometimes we have a 6 tefach amma. Which one do we apply? Depending on the situation. Whichever one will result in a chumrah. For instance, when we're discussing the height of the sukkah, or the height of the mavi, which is a maximum of 20 ammas, we're going to employ the smaller amma. So once you've reached the 20 ammas using the smaller amma, you've reached your maximum height. When it comes to kalayim, we're measuring the area which is required to allow planting. In this case, we employ the amma which has 6 tefachim, so we require a large area to allow planting. So we go to chumrah. Rava told us that all ammas that the Chacham discussed actually consist of 6 tefachim. So they're all created equal, except that there's a difference in the result of the size of the amma based on how close those fingers are going to be lying next to each other. Meaning the tefach can either be a generous, a loose tefach, or a tight, a fastened, a constricted tefach. The Gemara calls the amma an amma soichik and amma oitziv, or otziv. So soichik means smiling, generous, loose, easygoing, and the atzeves are those ammas which are sad, depressed, and constricted. The Mefarshim explained the difference between one and the other is very minor. It's actually only a half a etzba, so the width of a half a finger. That is the difference between the amma which is soichik and the amma which is atziv. So again, according to Abaye, we employ either a 6 tefach amma or a 5 tefach amma, depending on the situation. According to Rava, we employ the 6 tefach amma in all situations which the Chacham discussed, except the difference will be whether it's going to be a generous amma or a more restricted amma, and which one are we going to apply depending on the situation, depending which one results in a chumrah. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein explains that certainly the Chachamim knew the exact measurement of the amma, but they were concerned that perhaps if we're going to be exact, then a person might actually undermeasure, miss the proper measurement, so therefore they require him to add a bit more, either to turn it into a 6 tefach amma, or, according to Rava, a generous 6 tefach amma to cover all bases, to make sure that he measured properly. Continues the Gemara on the bottom line of Gimel Beis. Meisvei, we have a kasha from our Brisa, which seems to teach us, unlike Abaye's shita, Kol amish amar chacham, all the ammas that the Chacham discussed, the amma bas shisha, is an amma which consists of 6 tvachim, provided that they're not all equal, meaning we take the 6 tefach amma. Sometimes we have a generous one, the seichekos, and sometimes we have the atzeves, depending on the situation. By sukkah and mavi, we'll use the atzeves, the smaller 6 tefach amma. By kalayim, we'll use the broader, generous 6 tefach amma. So this works well according to Rava, that all ammas have 6 tefachim. Bishleim milu Rava. So this is good according to Rava, kiyechi. The lehavi and halol is seichekos, halol atzeves. When the Brisa says they're not mechuvanos, they're not all exactly equal, it simply means to say that this 6 tefach amma sometimes is a bit generous, and sometimes it's a bit sad and constricted, depending on whether it's sukkah, mava, or kalayim. But all ammas have 6 tvachim. Elul Abaye kasha. But according to Abaye, it's a kasha because the Brisa clearly says that we only use a amma which consists of 6 tvachim and not 5. Amalach Abaye. So Abaye will respond. Ema, you should learn the Brisa as follows. Amas kalayim ba'ama bas shisha. The Brisa here is specifically speaking about the measurements regarding kalayim, which indeed employ an amma of 6 tvachim. When it comes to the other types of measurements, sukkah mavoi, we're going to apply an amma of 5 tvachim. Says Mar, how could you say this shot in the Brisa? V'amediktani seifa. If we take a look at the next part of the Brisa, which says Rav Shimon Gamliel Oimer, he seems to disagree with the Tanakam, and he says, Kol amma is she'amar chachamim. Big kalayim, all the ammas that the Chachamim apply to kalayim, ba'ama bas shisha, is an amma which has 6 tvachim, u'bavad shelo yu mitzumtzamis, provided that this amma which has 6 tefachim is not mitzumtzum, it's not exact, it's broad and generous, meaning it's employing the tefachim which are loose It's an amma which is soichik. So the fact that Rav Shimon Gamliel says, well, the amma of 6 tefachim is meant to be applied strictly to kalayim, and he's coming to disagree with the Tanakama, who seems to say otherwise. Because why would he be arguing if there's no disagreement? So apparently the Tanakama indicates otherwise. He holds that the amma of 6 tefachim is going to be applied everywhere, all over, not only by kalayim. Mechlal the Tanakama sa kol amas ka'amar. Apparently Tanakama holds that all amas will employ this 6 tefach amma. And that's why Reb Shimon responds and says, no, only by kalayim is one meant to apply the amma which has 6 tefachim. So the Tanakama, which holds otherwise, seems to contradict Abaye. Tanakama says all amas have 6 tefachim, unlike Abaye. Says the Gemara, Amalach Abaye. So I will respond, okay. V'lav mi'ika, Rab Shimon Gamliel, the koi kavasi. Do I not have Rab Shimon Gamliel, who concurs with me? I know the Amri, Rab Shimon Gamliel. Okay, I'm going to be compatible with his shita. That is that the amma of 6 tefachim is only applied to kalayim and not to sukkah and to mavi. So indeed, according to Abaye, there's a machlekes tanaim. Rab Shimon Gamliel holds that the amma of 6 tefachim is applied to kalayim and not to the other places, as opposed to the Tanakama, who maintains that all amas are amas ba'as shisha tefachim. Says more la Abaye vadi tanai. Okay, indeed, according to Abaye, there's a machlekes tanaim. L'Rava milema tanai. But according to Rav, are we really forced to say that it's a machlekes tanaim here? That Rav Shimon Gamliel holds that sometimes we employ an amma bas chamisha, sometimes an amma bas shisha, and he disagrees with the Tanakama, who holds that all amas are meant to contain 6 tefachim. Or perhaps should we say that he's merely coming to explain the words of Tanakama? He's not coming to disagree at all. Tanakama began the brayso by saying all amas discussed by the Chachamim consist of 6 tefachim, and Tanakama added a few words. This is on the top of the Amud. Now what do you mean to say by that? He meant to say that sometimes there's a difference in the size within the ammas that contain 6 tefachim. Sometimes it's a soichik, it's a generous, loose amma. Sometimes it's an oitzev, it's a small, restricted amma. So within 6 tefachim you can have 2 sizes. But he didn't elaborate, he didn't explain where you apply this one and where you apply the other one. And that's why Shimon comes to add and he says, look, we're meant to use it lechumra. That's why by kalayim we use the broader one. But certainly he's not coming to disagree with Tanakam in any way. All agree that the amma has 6 tefachim. Rav Shimon Gamliel is merely coming to explain that when do we use the larger, the more looser and generous 6 tefach amma, the amma which is soichek, by kalayim, because it comes out of chumra. So that's the Gemara's question. Can we say that pshat, which will avoid the machlekes, and therefore according to Rava, all will agree that an amma has 6 tefachim? Says the Gemara, L'Rava milei Tanahi. Are we forced to say that it's a machlekes tanaim, or perhaps he's merely come to explain the words of Tanakama? Amalach Rava, indeed, there's no machlekes. Rav Shimon Gamliel, ha'asla shmi'inan, he's merely coming to teach us amas kelaim le'itzamtzim, that when it comes to measuring kelaim, we're meant to use the more generous amma. But certainly all agree that an amma contains 6 tefachim, and there's no machlekes. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, why doesn't Rav Shimon Gamliel simply state that? Why does he need to go into this great detail? And he says that all ammas of kalayim have 6 tefachim, which seems to indicate that not all times do we employ the amma of 6 tefachim. For instance, by sukkah and mavi, we're not going to use the amma of 6 tefachim. That's what it sounds from his words, because he's so marach, he elaborates in such great detail. Why doesn't he simply say, if he's merely coming to explain Tanakama's words, he should simply say, well, the amma of kalayim is the generous amma. V'lema, why doesn't he simply say, Amas kalayim le'itzamtzim? That the amma employed by kalayim is an amma which is not mitzumtzum. He can't restrict it amma, he has to use a generous amma. If that's all he's coming to say. Ba'amma bas shisha l'mutimai. When he elaborates and he says that kalayim uses an amma of 6, what is he coming to exclude by saying that? It appears that he's coming to say, well, only kalayim will use the amma of 6 tefachim, but otherwise not. For instance, mavoi and sukkah will not use an amma bas chamisha, but rather amma bas shisha, but rather amma bas chamisha. Lav l'muti amma sukkah, ammas mavi. Isn't he coming to exclude the amma used by the sukkah and the mavi, which will use an amma of chamisha tefachim? So it seems that he indeed does disagree with Tanakama. Says the Gemara, no, loy. He's not coming to exclude mavoy or sukkah. He agrees that in all those cases, we measure using an amma bas shisha tefachim. What then is he coming to exclude? He's coming to exclude cases where all shittas agree. Even Rava agrees that we use an amma bas chamisha tefachim, as the pasuk tells us to do. Lemute amma yisoid, the amma employed in measuring the base of the mizbeach, v'amma soiviv, or the amma, which is the walkway around the mizbeach, which were measured using an amma. What type of amma? A small amma. An amma of 5 tefachim. And that's what Reb Shimon Gamliel is coming to exclude. But certainly, both Shittas, Tanakama and Reb Shimon, agree that generally speaking, the amma has 6 tefachim. Tichseva, as we find in the pasuk, that there were actually four times in the Beis Hamikdash that we use the amma bas chamisha tefachim. The pasuk says, the pasuk in Yecheskel describing the measurement of the mizbeach, ve'elu midos hamizbeach. These are the measurements of the mizbeach. Ba'amos, using amos, amma v'toifach. So generally speaking, the mizbeach was measured using a large size amma, an amma which has 6 tefachim, and within that amma of 6 tefachim, you can fit in a small amma of 5 tefachim plus a tefach, right? That equals 6. So those ammas measuring the rest of the mizbeach employed large size ammas. What type of ammas? Amma v'toifach, an amma which had a small amma with a tefach in it. So that's regarding the rest of the mizbeach. But there were 4 locations in which they used a small amma, an amma of 5 tefachim. What were they? Number 1, v'cheika amma. The Gemara soon will explain. V'cheika amma, that's number 1. V'amma roichav, that's number 2. Ugvula el sfasa savev zeres echad, that's the 3rd area. And v'zeg av mizbeach, that's the 4th area. Explains the Gemara. Cheika amma is referring to as a yisoid. This is the base of the mizbeach, which was measured using a 5 tefach amma. The second place was v'amma roichav ze soivev. This is the walkway which was built into the mizbeach, and we measured using a 5 tefach amma. Ugvula sfasa saviv ela kronos. This is describing the corners built into the mizbeach. And finally, a 4th location with v'zeg av mizbeach is referring to ze mizbeach hazav, the golden mizbeach, the portable mizbeach, which was placed in the heichal, which was built using the small size amma of 5 tefach. So in summary, we discussed the different types of ammas which are used to measure things. According to Abaye, and he says this is the shita of Shimon Gamliel, when it comes to sukkah and mavoy, we measure using a 5 tefach amma. When it comes to kalayim, we use a 6 tefach amma, and that amma is meant to be the amma soichik, the generous amma, using generously placed fingers when it comes to measuring the tefach. Rava maintains that all agree that generally an amma is meant to have 6 tefachim. Even Tanakama and Shimon Gamliel both agree to that. Shimon Gamliel is merely coming to explain Tanakama. Sometimes we employ a tefach soichik, sometimes it's a tefach otzif, depending on the situation. By sukkah and mavi, we use a more narrow amma. When it comes to kalayim, we use an amma soichik, a more generous, a looser amma, which results in a larger amma, and this results in a chumrah. Now all agree, when it comes to the following 4 elements, we employ a small amma, an amma which has 5 tefachim. Those 4 things are the yisoid of the mizbeach, the soivev, the kronos, and the mizbeach hazav. Continues the Gemara. Amar Abchia bar Ashi Amarav, Shiurin chatzitzin u'machitzin. These 3 things, halacha Moshe Sinai, were taught us through Moshe, accepted from Sinai. Let's take a look at Rashi. 10 lines from the bottom. Shiurin. What is this? These are the measurements. Shiurin shenasnu chacham l'chol davar. The chachamim applied to all different types of things. Kagoin, for instance, kazayis dam. What is the size, the volume of dam, which is awesome in our Torah? A kazayis of dam, a kazayis of chelev, pigel, v'noiser, all these different various forbidden foods. So if a person eats a kazayis, he gets malchus. The kazayis v'nam meis shemetama ba'oil. And a kazayis size of a mace, which parts tumah under a roof, a shiurim, the first come on, and likewise all the other various other shiurim measurements which will be described soon in the Gemara. So that's number 1. The shiurim was given halacha Moshe Sinai. What's the second thing on the list? Chatzitzin. Chatzitza b'tzelos with tefillah. A barrier, something which is sitting on a person's skin, preventing the water from actually touching it when he's tevel in the mikveh. The fact that this disqualifies a tefillah, this was learned halacha Moshe Sinai. And the third thing on the list is mechitzin, hilchas mechitza. The halacha is a partition shtei kvoy asara, that the minimum height of a mechitza needs to be 10 tefachim. V'chein sh'ar hilchaseh. Likewise, all other halachas of mechitzas, halacha Moshe Sinai, were taught us in the name of Moshe, who accepted it by Sinai. So again, says the Gemara, Shiur and Chatzitzin and Mechitzin, halacha Moshe Sinai. Says the Gemara, is that the case? That they were taught through Moshe Sinai, Torah Sheba'al Peh, Shiur and Doiraisahu. The various measurements seem to be included in Torah Sheba'chsav and the Pasuk. Why do we need it to be taught through Torah Sheba'al Peh? The Pasuk says, describing these Shivas Aminim, these 7 special species, which Eretz Yisrael was blessed with, Eretz Chita v'Soira, v'Gefen, v'Te'ena v'Rimoin, Eretz Yishem and Dvash. So the Pasuk gives us a list of the Shivas Aminim, which was special and unique for Eretz Yisrael. V'Amar Avchanan, Kol HaPasuk hazeh l'shi'ur nemar. The point and purpose of this Pasuk is to describe the Shvach, the praise of Eretz Yisrael. Look, even the fruits, the produce of Eretz Yisrael, are used in the context of halacha to measure various measurements pertaining to halachas. Says the Gemara, Chita, the wheat is going to be measured for the following halacha. Look at this, not as we learned in the Mishnah. If one enters a home which has a nega, the halacha is that he becomes tameh immediately upon entry. The same thing regarding a chayfetz, an object, which enters that home. Now what if he's carrying the clothing on him, meaning he's wearing his clothing? Then a different halacha applies. Then he must remain in that home long enough for a Shiur Suda to complete a meal. He doesn't actually need to eat, but needs to wait that time frame of a Shiur Suda. And only then do the begadim that he's wearing become tameh. Says the Mishnah, Nechas lebayis hamanuga. If one enters a bayis hamanuga which has a nega, v'kelev al kseifav, and he's carrying his begadim, his clothing on his shoulder, he's not wearing them. V'sandolav, v'tabayis b'yadav, and his sandals, his rings are sitting in his hands, meaning he's not actually wearing them. Then we treat them like ordinary objects, and they become tameh immediately upon entry. Who? Vehem, this fellow and the objects that he's carrying, tameh miyad, will become tameh immediately upon entry. But if he's wearing them, then a different halacha applies. Haya lavush kelav, if he was wearing his garments, v'sandola birraglav, and his sandals, his shoes sitting on his feet, v'tabaisa betzbaisa, and he's wearing his rings on his fingers, in which case we regard them as begadim, as malbushim. They're bottled to him. They have a different halacha. Who tameh miyad? This fellow will become a tameh immediately upon entry to the home. Vehein tahir, but they remain tahir until he waits a while. Until he waits around. B'chdech pras, the time that it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread. Rashi explains this loaf contains 2 sudas worth. So pras is half of that loaf, which is the amount of 1 su'udah. So if he waits in the home, as long as it takes for a person to eat this amount, which is a Shiur Suda, this is learned from a pasuk, this is long enough to make the clothing on this person tameh as well. Now when we speak about this half a loaf of bread, what is consisted? What is this bread made of? What type of ingredients? Is it wheat? Is it barley? Says the Mishnah, pas chitim v'lo pas so'er. We're speaking about a bread made of wheat flour, not so'er made of barley. Rashi says the wheat flour, the bread made of wheat is eaten quicker, so it's actually a chumrah, it's less time. Mesev, we measure it based on a person eating it reclined, in which case he's focusing on his meal, and he's not dilly-dallying, he's not taking his time, it's a shorter amount of time. Eating it with some sort of relish, some sort of accompaniment to the bread, which assists in the eating, and it's eaten quicker in this manner. So the chita, the wheat, is used to measure this shear of the bayis hamanuga, the bread made of wheat. Sa'ira, where do we apply the concept of the measurement of a sa'ira to halacha? This is not, as we learned in the Mishnah, etzam kasa'ira, a piece of bone which is merely the size of a barley. That's the minimum of size of the bone to have the ability to impart tumah to metame, b'maga, b'masa, to transfer tumah through direct touching or through carrying. So that's the minimum size of an etzam, the size of a sa'ira of a barley. So we apply the concept of barley to halacha. So tumah b'maga, b'masa, ve'edim b'tam oil doesn't have the ability to transfer tumah through the tumas oil, through the same roof. If somebody's sitting under the roof with this etzem, he doesn't receive tumah from the etzem. So it's a limited tumah, and the shear is based on the sa'ira. Where do we apply the concept of gefen to a shiur? Gefen is kedei revius yain lenazir. What it means is that a nazir, person who undertook a vow not to eat, drink wine, he's not allowed to even eat grapes. How much grapes? What is the shiur? That's based on revius yain, the amount of grapes which equal a revius halug of wine. That is the shiur in which he would get malchus if he eats while he's a nazir. So he says this applies to the grapes or even parts of the plant of the grapevine. So the shiur is measured according to wine, meaning it has to equal the revius of wine. So we see the concept of gefen, of a vine, of grapes, which applies to the halacha. Te'ena, where do we see that a te'ena, a fig, is applied to halacha? Ki goygeris, let's say, Shabbos. When it comes to measuring the shiur for liability of hitzah on Shabbos, when it comes to oichlin, if a person carries food stuff out, something that's edible to a person, what is the minimum shiur? It needs to be the size of gergeris of a dried fig. So we see that a fig is applied to halacha. Rimain, where do we see that a pomegranate, the size of a rimain, is applicable to halacha, the snan, as we learned. Kol klei balibatim. So these klei balibatim are these wooden utensils which a ordinary homeowner uses. And he's more makbid on his kelim. He doesn't simply discard them when they get a small hole. If it gets a small hole, so he'll use it for a larger size item. If it gets even a bigger hole, he's going to use it for larger objects, up to a point. Says the Mishnah, Kol klei balibatim shiurim kirimayim. So if it gets a hole the size of a rimain, in this case it's already batal, it's no longer regarded as a utensil, and it's no longer tamid. So we see that the size of a rimain is applicable to halacha. The pasuk concludes, Eretz zeis shemen advash. We learn from here, Eretz, a land, shekol shiurei kazeisim, all these shiurim of the Torah. For instance, the isra of chel of dam, or these forbidden foods, or tumah of nevela. All these things are measured using the volume of a zayis. Says, well, what do you mean all the shiurim? Kol shiur sakadaitach, all the shiurim of the Torah? What about all these that we just mentioned that are unrelated to kazayis? Ella, rather, Ema, say Eretz shiroiv shirei kazeisim, a land who most of the shiurim of the Torah are related to with the volume of the zayis. So Rashi says the achila of chelav, of dam, of noiser, pigel, tamei, the shiur of nevela, behematmei, basar ameis, many halachas in the Torah are dependent on the shiur of kazayis. And finally, the pasuk says this is a seventh of the shivas haminim. Eretz shemen udvash. Dvash here is speaking about not honey from a honeycomb, but rather it's referring to dates which produce honey. So dvash is employed in halacha as follows: Kikei seves hagasa Yom Kippurim. Where do we have the measurement of a date? When it comes to Yom Kippur, a person's only chayiv if he eats the amount of food which equals the volume of a kesefes hagasa, which is a large-sized date. So we see that a date applies to halacha. So in any case, we have a kasha, because we began the Gemara that the concept of shiurim, the various measurements, were taught halacha l'Moshe Messina Torah Sheba'al Peh. Here we have a pasuk which gives us a list of all the shiurim. It's Torah Shebechsav. So why do we need to learn from halacha l'Moshe Messina? Says Rav Tisba, do you really think so? Shiurim michtav ksivi? Are the shiurim actually listed in this pasuk and described in detail? No. It's merely a pasuk describing shivas saminim. How do we know all the details of the measurements? Actually, it is based on halacha l'Moshe Sinai. All these shiurim, for instance, that Yom Kippur is connected to a large date, etc. This was taught through Moshe Sinai. Rabbanah took those shiurim and supported it with the psukim, meaning they related it to these items found in this pasuk. But certainly, the pasuk on its own doesn't really teach us much about the detailed shiurim. Certainly, we need to learn it halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So that explains the first item on the list, shiurin, chatzitzin, mechitzin, shiurin, meaning all these measurements which were taught through Moshe Sinai. What was the next thing on that list? Chatzitzin. Those barriers during tefillah. A person has something which is preventing the water from coming into contact with his skin. The tefillah, his immersion is pasul. Says the Gemara, chatzitzin do'iraisa. That also is learned from a pasuk. Why do we need halacha l'Moshe Sinai? As the pasuk says, v'rachatz eskol b'soroi b'mayim. We learn from here like this. We learn from here the fact that the pasuk says Rachas is called psoroi, his flesh. Why does the pasuk need to explain it in such great detail? his flesh. It's teaching us that it must be a direct contact between his basar, his skin, and the water. There can't be anything, any interposition, any barrier, which is preventing the water from reaching his skin. So that's the first thing we learn. From the word psara, we learn that he cannot have a chatzitza. What do we learn from ba'mayim? B'mei mikvah. He's meant to immerse in a mikvah. Ba'mayim, the known waters, the water which is stationary in place. He's going into a mikvah. Rashi explains the water can't be in motion; it can be on the move. He needs to go into this very unique, very specific type of water, which is sitting in one place. It's a mikvah. The third thing we learn from this pasuk is kol b'sari. The pasuk says brachas is kol b'sari. What's the point of kol? His entire basar. This teaches us he must be going in all at once. He can't do it incrementally. He can't put in his foot and then his hand. Kol b'sari. We learn from here that the mikvah needs to be large enough to allow his whole body to enter at once. Mayim shekol gufa yoilben. Since he needs to do it all at once, the mayim needs to be large enough to allow his whole body to be toivel in them. V'kamahin. Now, how much is it? What is the shiur of a mikvah? Amma brum gimel amis. Because the width of a person is an amma. So the mikvah needs to accommodate the person. Therefore, the mikvah likewise needs to be an amma, meaning an amma length, an amma width. Brum gimel amis, at a height of 3 amis, to allow a person to enter. So that's the size of the space of the mikvah. Now, how much water? V'shiur chachamim. The chachamim estimated, based on this dimension, mei mikvah mem sa. The mei mikvah needs to have 40 sa, which is the quantity of water which fits into this location, an area, a hole, which is amal amma, at a height of 3 amas. So you see clearly from this pasuk that a chatzitza is unacceptable. So why do we need halacha Moshe Sinai to teach us this halacha? Says the Gemara, ki itzrich hilchasa. You know why we need the halacha? L'sa'arei, to come and tell us that even when there's a chatzitza on a person's hair, which is not the primary part of the person, it's secondary, it's an outgrowth of the person. Perhaps chatzitza on the person's hair is not so significant and doesn't invalidate the tefillah. That's what the halacha is coming to teach us. Halacha Moshe Sinai, that even a chatzitza which is present on a person's hair makes the tefillah apostle. Ukad Rabba bar Huna, as he taught us, the Omar Rabba Rav Huna, Nima achas kshura chaytzetzes. There's one hair which is self-tied, so it's a self-knot, one hair in itself. Chaytzetzes. That makes chatzitza because the water can't really enter into that knot. One hair which is tied into itself creates a firm, a tight knot, which prevents water from entering. Shalish. What if there are 3 hair which are tied into each other? Don't make a chatzitza because they can't be so tightly wound around each other, and evidently some water will enter and there's no chatzitza. Shtayim any day. What if there are 2 hair tied with each other? I'm not sure what the halacha there is, because perhaps it's not as tight as 1, but perhaps it's not as loose as 3, so we don't know exactly whether or not it poses a chatzitza. So you see clearly that the concept of chatzitza applies to seir, to a person's hair. The Gemara at this point figures that is what the point of the Halacha Shina was, to teach us that chatzitza applies even to one's hair. Says the Gemara, that's also learned from a pasuk. The pasuk, which we just said, Sa'ari nami doiraisu, even a person's hair that needs to be free of chatzitzas, that is learned from the pasuk. The Sani, as we learned, v'rochatz es kol b'sarei. Why does the pasuk say the word es? Es is generally coming to add something. It's coming to teach us. Es hatafel b'sarei. That even the hair which is tafel, which is secondary to a person's flesh, v'zeo seir, that's referring to a person's hair, that there as well a chatzitza cannot be present. So it's a pasuk. Why do we need a halacha Moshe Sinai? So in summary, from this pasuk, we have 4 things that we learn. Number 1, we learn there can't be any chatzitza, not on the flesh and not on his hair. Number 2, he needs to go into a mikveh, which is stationary. Number 3, the mikveh, which is stationary. Number 4, it needs to be all at once. He can't go in part by part. So in any case, we learned that a sayar can't have chatzitza from the pasuk. Why is the halacha needed for that? Says the Gemara, you know what the halacha is coming to teach us? It's coming to give us the exact details of the halachas of chatzitza. It's coming to teach us that a chatzitza will only be considered a chatzitza if it has 2 elements. Number 1, on account of its large size. It needs to be roiv. It needs to encompass most of the person's body. It needs to be a large size chatzitza to be considered significant enough to pose a problem. Number two, he has to have a personal dislike for the presence of this thing. He has to be distressed about this dirt that's sitting on him. So both elements need to combine, need to come together. And only then is it considered to be a chatzitza min haTorah. So that's the point of Lachem Mishmasina, to give us those details, to explain to us, to elaborate to us how exactly a chatzitza forms. It says, you know what Allah is coming to teach us? L'rubai ul'mi'utai. When it's roiv, or it's only mi'ut of the body, ul'makpid, when a person is makpid on it, ul'she'ein makpid, when he's not makpid. Meaning, it's coming to teach us that you need to conform. It needs to have two elements in order to be a chatzitza. As Rabbi Yitzchak taught us, Dvar Torah, Dvar Torah, min haTorah, meaning halacha mishmasinai, you need to have two elements. Rubai u'makpid of chaytitz. Only when both factors are present. Number one, it's rubai, it's encompassing most of a person's body. It's such a large size chatzitza. Or as Rashi says, most of a person's hair. And number two, makpid alav. He's personally distressed about it. He dislikes the fact that it's there. So both things come together. On account of the significance of the thing itself. Number two, on account of that personal disregard for it. Rubai u'makpid alav chaytitz. Only then is it considered to be a chatzitza. It can't be bottled to the person. It can't be regarded as part of his flesh. It's too big and significant. But if both elements aren't there, only one element is there, then min haTorah, there's no concern. But if he's not makpid on it, then it's not chaytz, even if it's large and it's present over most of the person's body. There's no concern because he is not makpid on it. So again, both elements are required. Number one, it needs to be large in size. Number two, he has personal negation to it. This is min haTorah. Midrabanan, they said, even if only one element, only one factor is there, it is considered chatzitza. Whether if it's roiv or if he's makpid, either one will constitute chatzitza midrabanan. Why? We're concerned that if we allow this, perhaps this will lead one to a chatzitza min haTorah, where both elements are present. Says the Gemara, they made a decree al rubai she'eino makpid. When it's a large size chatzitza, even if he's not makpid, he couldn't care less that it's there. They said it's a chatzitza, don't be toivel with it. Why? Because this might lead to a person being toivel with a true chatzitza. Mishum rubi ha-makpid. He might lead to doing it even when he is makpid on it. In which case, since it's roiv and makpid, it's a chatzitza min haTorah. So therefore they said, even when he's not makpid, it's asur. Likewise, they said, even when he's makpid on just a small chatzitza, he shouldn't be toivel with that. Ve'al mi'utai ha-makpid. When he's makpid, even when it's just a small size chatzitza, only is present on the small portion of a person's body, he shouldn't be toivel. Why? Because this might lead him to be toivel even when it's a real chatzitza. Mishum rubi ha-makpid. This might lead him to do a tvil even when it's rubi ha-makpid. Therefore they said, look, when it's rubai, don't be toivel. When it's makpid, don't be toivel. Because it might lead to him being toivel even when both elements are present together. Says the Gemara, but if they made this gzera, why don't they go a step further? Even when none of these factors are present, it's only miut, and he's not makpid, let them make a gzera. Why? Because if we allow him to be toivel, in this case, he'll say, well, look, if I'm not makpid, it's okay. So let's say it's a large size chatzitza, and I'm not makpid, it's also fine. So this will lead him to do that. And that is awesome in the Rabbanon. Or he may say, look, when it's miut and I'm not makpid, I can be toivel. So even when it's a miut and I am makpid, I'll be toivel as well, which is awesome in the Rabbanon. So there's always a concern that I might lead to the next step. Says the Gemara of the ligzor nami, Chacham should also make a gzera al miut she'eino makpid. When both elements are absent, it's miut and he's not makpid, it should also be asur. Why? Mishum miut ha-makpid, on account of miut ha-makpid, because if he'll be toivel when he has a miut she'eino makpid, he might be toivel even when the miut is makpid. He'll say, oh, miut is fine, it's just small, insignificant chatzitza, let me be toivel. And he won't realize this is different because he's being makpid. Says one will lead to the next. Inami. Or another concern will be that if we allow him to be toivel when no elements are present, when it's miut and eino makpid, he might say, well, I see that kpeda is so significant, and the lack of kpeda negates the chatzitza, is not considered chatzitza because I'm not makpid. So I'll be toivel even when it's a large size chatzitza. Inami mishum ruba sheni makvid. I'll say, well, any makvid is a slow criterion. That determines whether or not it's a chatzitza. So when I'm not makvid, I can be toivel even when it's a large size chatzitza, which is awesome d'Rabbanan. So why don't we say that even when it's miyut, even when he's not makvid, when there are no elements present, it should be asr midrabbanan? Says the Gemara, why is it asr? Why is it a chatzitza when one factor is present? That's not minat Torah. That's merely midrabbanan. The Rabbanan made a gzera lest he come to be toivel when both factors are present. So that in itself is a safeguard. He gufa gzera. That in itself is a safeguard for the deraisa. It's a fence around the din haTorah. V'anan neikov v'nigzer. Gzera, do you propose that we should get up and make a gzera to a gzera? To go a step further and say, well, even when none are present, no factors are there, it should be asr, it should be a puzzle, it should be a chatzitza. For concern that it might lead him to be toivel even when one element is there, which is asr d'Rabbanan, but that in itself is not really asr, minat Torah. It's only d'Rabbanan to safeguard the dinat Torah, which is strictly when two elements are present. It's roiv and he's makvid. Chacham never do that. They don't make a double safeguard, they fence around the fence. We know that the Rabbanan were given authority to make zeros, the pasuk says, to make a mishmeres. And we learn from there, only a mishmeres, a safeguard, one safeguard to the Torah. Chacham are there to protect the Torah. But you can't make a mishmeres, limishmeres, as Rashi explains in Gemara Beitz, Daf Beis and Beis. So we don't make a double safeguard. So conclusion, minat Torah, when both elements are present, it is a large size chatzitza rubai, and encompasses most of the person's body. And he personally dislikes the presence of this thing, he's distressed about it, he's makbid alav, only then is it significant enough and can be batal to him and it's a chatzitza. It makes that barrier between the water and the person. But if only one element is present, either it's roiv or it's makbid, it's only asr d'Rabbanan. When no elements are present, it's mutzah d'Rabbanan. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. 16 lines from the top, beginning with the words b'mayim b'mei mikvah. So we learn from the word b'mayim that it must be a mikvah water. Explains Rashi, mei mikvah ha'mechunosen mashma. It means that it's sitting stationary, it's not on the move, it's not flowing. It needs to go into the place of the mikvah. Therefore it needs to be sitting stationary. Even though it's not live water, meaning it's not spring water, that's not necessary. But like Sif Chaim, the pasuk doesn't say it needs to be spring water. So even rainwater is fine, provided that it's sitting in one place. From the word kol b'sari, we learn mashma kol b'sari ke'echad. He needs to go in all at once. He can't be toivel incrementally. The Gemara tells us that halacha is coming to add that a chatzitza can pose a problem even if it's present on a person's hair. L'sa'ara should be possible by chatzitza. As Rabba taught us, Dama Rabba, chatzitza b'selos b'seir. Chatzitza will disqualify when it's present even in one's hair. And he describes the halacha as follows: Nima achas kshura chaytzetzes. If one hair is tied into itself, it poses a chatzitza the motzi laduk shaper, since he could fasten it and tie it tightly. Ve'inamayim nechnasim b'kesha, and the water doesn't have the ability to go into this knot, so it poses a chatzitza. But shalish, 3 hair which are tied together in and chaytzetzes, don't pose a chatzitza. The loy mehatki shaper, since they don't get tied firmly, va'aylubu mayim, and water can get right in there. And the Gemara told us that the halacha mishum Sinai is coming to teach us the parameters of chatzitza. Dvar Torah halacha mishum Sinai v'Torah sheba'al peh is coming to teach us that there are 2 factors which need to join together to produce a chatzitza. Number 1, rubai, majority. Explains Rashi, roiv sorry, most of us hair. Shim yesh b'davar chaytzitz, if there's a davar chaytzitz in most of his hair, could go in dam yavish, dried blood, v'dyoy, dried ink, v'tit yavish, dried clay, v'zefes yavish, dried pitch, oshakosha rubai achas achas. Well, most of his hair is tied a single hair at a time, which poses a chatzitza. Taisus adds that this concept applies even to most of his body, meaning the chatzitza must be present in most of a person's body. So that's number 1. The first element is rubai. Number 2, that personal negation and dislike to the presence of the chatzitza. He's distressed about the presence of this dirt in his hair. Only when those 2 factors come together, it is considered chatzitza v'nater. But if he is not makvid, then it's not a chatzitza. Why? Explains Rashi, the svar is haveke gufay. It's considered like his guf, it's batal to him. Even if it's a large chatzitza, a large thing there that's taking place in most of his body, it's present berubai, it's not a chatzitza because he personally doesn't care that it's there. That's minator. The Rabbanan said even one element poses chatzitza. V'gazru al rubai she'ena makbid. They said that if it's a large chatzitza, it's roiv. Although he's not makbid, we consider it a chatzitza. Why? Hoyel b'avi roiv, since it has that roiv element. V'dami b'mixas the chatzitza deraisa. It is a bit similar to the chatzitza deraisa. Therefore, it is a chatzitza d'Rabbanan. Likewise, if he's makbid, even it's so small in size, it's also chatzitza hoyel v'dami leibakbada, since it has a similarity to the chatzitza deraisa, because in both cases he's makbid. So since it has that one element that he's makbid, they were concerned this might lead to the other one, and they made exer v'gazru. Says Rashi v'gazru lav halacha mishmesinahu. This doesn't mean halacha mishmesina. Exer v'drabanan. It's merely midrabanan. V'rubi ha-makbid chudei. It's only when there's roiv and he's makbid that is the chatzitza min ha-Torah who the halacha mishmesina. So in summary, regarding tvila, from the pasuk we learn four things. V'rochatz, it's called psari b'mayim. We learn like this. V'rochatz es, that includes that even the sari, even a person's hair, which is secondary to the person, which is es, which is tafel to him, must be free of chatzitzas. From the word koil, we learn that he must immerse entirely all at once, kol gufa, and therefore the mikvah needs to accommodate the person all at once. From the word b'sari, we learn that there must be direct contact between a person's flesh and the mikvah, the water. There can't be chatzitza. From b'mayim, we learn there needs to go into a mikvah. The Halacha Mishmesina teaches us that a chatzitza is only if it contains both elements. Number one, it's a large chatzitza, roiv. Roiv of the body, roiv of the hair, according to Rashi. Number two, he's makbid. He's distressed about the presence of that chatzitza. Midrabanan, even if one element is present, either roiv or makbid, is considered chatzitza. Okay, let's get back to that list that we learned halacha l'meshmesinai, shiur, chatzitza, and mechitzin, shiur being those measurements, chatzitza, the halachas of chatzitza, and finally mechitzin, the halachas of partitioning. For instance, that a mechitza needs to be at least 10 tefachim high to be considered a mechitza. Says the Gemara, we need to learn that from the Torah Shabbat Peh, halacha l'meshmesinai. Mechitza is d'oraisa nenu. We learn mechitzas from our pasuk. The Amar as we learned, Aron Tisha. How high was the Aron? It was 9 tefachim high because it was an amma and a half, an amma 6 tefachim. So 1.5 times 6 is 9. So the Aron was 9 plus it had a lid. The kapiras tefach, it had a lid which was a tefach thick. Harakanasara. This gives us a total of 10 tefachim from the floor till the surface, the top surface of the Aron. And we learn from here that a mechitza needs to be 10 tefachim high. How do we learn from here? Rashi explains, because in the Gemara Sukkah, Rabbi Yossi tells us that the Shekhinah never descended, never came down all the way to the Aretz. Now, the fact that the Shekhinah spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu from on top of the Aron indicates that that was not considered to be Aretz, because it was 10 tefachim removed from the ground. So we see from there that the domain, the reshus of the Aretz, extends upward only up to the point of 10 tefachim. So therefore, when a person goes ahead and erects a mechitza, makes a wall between one rishus and the other, for instance, between Rishus Hayach and Rishus Rabbim, how high must he go? He must go 10 tefachim to separate the two rishus, because the point is that the rishus extends upward until 10 tefachim. So we learn this concept from the pasuk, from the Aron. We don't need to learn it from Halacha Mishmei Sinai. Says the Gemara, like tzricha. Apparently, this derivation from Halacha Mishmei Sinai is only needed according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar who told us, Amaz binyan ba'ama bas shisha. Rabbi Yehuda said as follows: when they built the Beis Hamikdash, they used the Amma which contained 6 tefachim. Amaz kalim, however, when they crafted the kalim, the various vessels, for instance the Aron, ba'ama bas chamisha, they employed a smaller size Amma which contained only 5 tefachim. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Aron was not 10 tefachim off the ground, because it was 1.5 amas. An amma is merely 5 tefachim. So 1.5 times 5 is 7.5, plus the kaperes, which was another tefach, for a total of only 8.5 tefachim. So we can't learn any concept of the mechitza asara from the Aron. So apparently that's why we need Halacha Mishmei Sinai to come teach us the halacha that a mechitza must be 10 tefachim high. Says the Gemara, Uluramei the Amar, Kala amas hayu beinayis. But according to Ramei, who says that all amas, meaning the ones used to measure the building, the structure of Beis Hamikdash, and likewise the ones used to build the kalim, were all these beinani amas, intermediate amas. Rashi explains that it's a 6 tefach amma. Why is it called a beinani? Because there was actually a larger amma, as Rashi explains. So if the six tefach amma is employed when it comes to the building of the aron, which leaves us a total of 10 tefachim height, so we learn the halacha of mechitza from there. Why do we need the halacha of Sinai? Michael and Meima. What are we going to say? Says the Gemara, the Rav Meir. According to Rav Meir, the hilchasa is coming to tell us other aspects of the halachas of mechitzas. L'gud, l'lavud, l'defen hakuma. The halacha of Sinai will come teach us other elements of mechitzas. Good means slice off the mechitza and lift it, for instance. Let's say you have a mound in Rosh Hashanah, which is 10 tefachim high. But on top of the mound, on the surface above, there are no mechitzas enclosing it. That's considered shesayachid. Why? Because we view the walls, the sides of the mound, as though they're sliced off and lifted up above onto the surface, creating an enclosed area. So this is learned halacha mishum Sinai. What is the second thing? Lavud. Lavud means an extension. So if you have a small hole in a wall, which is less than 3 tefachim, we ignore it. We don't reckon with that hole. It's not large enough to break that wall, to negate the wall. We view the wall as though it's extending over that hole and it's enclosing it. This is what we learned yesterday. If a sukkah features some pasul schach around the perimeters of the schach near the walls, so if that schach is only less than 4 amas in width, then it's okay, because we look at the wall, the doifen, as though it's akum, as though it's slanting. The schach is considered to be part of that wall, and the wall is extending all the way to the middle of the sukkah, which contains schach kasher. So therefore, that schach pasul doesn't invalidate the entire sukkah. This is a concept which is learned at halacha mishum Sinai. So according to Rav Meir, the halacha mishum Sinai of mechitzim will come teach us these halachas. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, is coming to teach us these halachas in addition to the halacha that a mechitza needs to be 10 tefachim in height. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We began discussing different types of amos. According to Abai, which fits with Rosh Gamliel's view in the Brisa, the 5 tefach amma is employed by sukkah, by mavi. By kalayim, we use the 6 tefach amma. According to Rava, who's following both shittas, Tanakam and Rosh Gamliel, when it comes to sukkah, mavi, and kalayim, we employ the 6 tefach amma. The difference only will be that by sukkah, mavi, we use the more constricted amma, and by kalayim, the more generous amma. And the point here is that we go l'chumra in all cases. All agree that when it comes to certain elements, these soidev the mizbeach, these soiviv, the kronites, and the hazav, we measure using an amma which merely contains 5 tefachim. We proceeded with the pasuk describing the Shiva Samidim. The Gemara told us that every one of them can be applied to a measurement pertaining to a halacha. We proceeded with the halachas of chatzitza by tefillah. We learned it from a pasuk. And the halacha mishum Sinai teaches us the details of chatzitza. 2 elements are needed to create a chatzitza. And they're supposed to be large in size, rubai, and he has to be makbid on it. The person has to be distressed about the presence of that chatzitza. Even if one element is present, for instance, it's large in size, it's roiv, or he is makbid, is considered chatzitza. And the Gemara concluded that indeed the halacha mishum Sinai teaches us shiur and chatzitza and mechitzah, meaning as follows. Shiur, and we learn about the kazayis of dam, chelev, tumas meis, various measurements which are employed in halacha. The halacha mishum Sinai gives us the parameters of chatzitza. We need to have rubai and makbid. Mechitzah will teach us good, lavud, daifin akuma, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, will teach us the minimum height of a mechitza, which must be 10 tefachim.